Most women who tell you they're keeping it real aren't, at least in my opinion. And I just want to talk about Cardi B as being the only public example that I can share or point to of what doing it, keeping it real looks like. You know, she's someone who's been dragged for her voice, her choices, how she talks about money, her accent, and none of it made her adjust. I've actually been the first time I heard of her, and I watched when she was on Love and Hip Hop, New York, and that was what 100 years ago. Here she is, the same. I actually went to see her in I forgot where she came. She was in New York City. I went to see her. She was on the street standing on a car. The same. This was last year, 2025. You know, so having been even despite having been dragged for all these different things, she has not changed. In fact, I would say she's more popular now than she's ever been. You know, she's still up there saying whatever she wants when she wants, like it or not, controversial or not, agree with it or not, values align or not. She's who she is, and that's why I'm sharing her as an example of what keeping it real really, really means, not what we're saying, you know. And I want to point out also too that it's not an accident, you know, because people can feel the difference between a woman who's truly herself, authentic, keeping it real, right, and a woman who's acting out a part of her or a version of her that has, in her opinion, passed the test of making her look like she wants to look or be perceived by others. And unfortunately, many of us never get to this point where we are fully self expressed, you know, because we'll continue to say we're keeping it real when what we're doing is just putting forth a persona of ourselves that we think is or we want to be seen as or we think is the way that we should appear, you know. So that doesn't leave for you to express yourself fully or even at all. And when I say that, I want to be honest about why it gets under my skin, keeping it real, being authentic. I can't stand those things, especially because they come from people who are doing the opposite. And, you know, also too, I want to mention that a lot of the time it's not, we don't know that we are this way, which is why it's it's much more nuanced, you know. It's easy to just say be yourself, because for the most part people think they are being themselves. I mean, there are some who are just pretending, but I feel like many genuinely don't know who they are and are doing all these things that they think is being themselves, you know. So what does it even mean when you say person should be themselves? Because the phrase does, it works for some in that when people say it, because it closes the door. It's like when people say, oh, God told me this. I mean, who's going to argue with God, right? Because that's essentially what it is when a person tells you, concludes something that's maybe a conversation that's going on or a revelation they share, and they tell you, God told me. You're like, okay, of course, God told you. So it's, I feel like it's the same thing when people say I'm being authentic or I'm just being myself. What you're doing in essence is you're just saying I don't want to deal with it. If I say this is who I am, nobody's going to argue with that, because in a sense that's what we want you to be, or that's how we want you to be, you know. So you can say I'm keeping it real. In that exact moment you're acting that you're keeping it real. And it just means the sentence is not proof of anything. What I will say is Cardi does not have to say that. I don't think, and maybe she does, but she's saying it, she's true to it. But I've never heard her say, I'm keeping it real. She just keeps it real. She just says what she has to say. She just does who what she wants to do. She just bees, more importantly. She bees. She's just being who she is. I don't mind forming words too. She just is. She really is just is. And the fact that the rest of us have to keep announcing this, um, keeping it real, is like, it's very telling, right? Because if saying it doesn't prove it, then what's actually underneath it for a lot of us? Underneath the produced fakeness, for want of a better word or way of expressing myself, there's an older reason There's another reason that not that that is more than just not feeling comfortable. You know, it's easy to say you're not doing that because you're not feeling comfortable. That is sometimes the case. That is even often there a lot. But there's also something on top of that, you know. Some of us are really at the core of it not convinced that we're enough. We don't feel enough. We don't feel worthy just as we are. Because I believe that if you genuinely believed deep down that the real you was enough, you wouldn't feel the need to pretend. And if even there was any type of feeling of it would be optional. But the way we lean into acting like, and putting on different airs and not being ourselves, it almost feels like a do or die type of situation. And that's very telling, you know. So it's not new. It's not new, and it's something that many, many, many of us have been grappling and dealing with and doing for many, many years. You know, no one's untangled it, likely because it would mean admitting how much of the life that we've been living is that version or that curated self instead of who you really are. And you would also have to admit that this is not a new thing. You're not at the beginning. You're true to it. You're not new to it. You're true to it, Decades and decades of living a life that looks like a pretend fake version of yourself, you know? It means that the real you isn't just there fully formed, chilling, waiting to be uncovered and revealed and yeah, whoa, here I am. It shows that the real you too, parts of you got run over as the years progressed, as life lifed. Some of that you got run over, and that's a different, harder problem than just saying be yourself. Because if yourself has been shifted a little bit, has been molded differently, has been tinkered with, just being yourself is not really always the solution, so to speak. But I want to say to you that the real you is there, even though parts of you may have gotten beaten up and remodeled and reconfigured. The core of you is still there, and she does pop up every now and again, even if it's not on purpose, even if it's inadvertently. Sometimes, and usually it's by accident. So when that happens and it's not intentional, it's quickly followed by correction, like a joke. When the real you when people glimpse the real you, what you do is you quickly change it, alter it, you laugh it off, you correct it. I'm just playing. You walk it back in some instances, but there are still glimpses of the real you who's still in there, but still not feeling safe, or still not feeling worthy, or still not feeling like you're enough. And that's why when you come out, there's a quick retraction or walking back, and that typically happens in 10 seconds after that part of you comes out, that real you comes out. It's a pattern that is one running, controlling this whole thing, and so it also makes it not as it makes it a bit nuanced, because it's not as clear as fake versus real. There's no split down the middle where it's like, okay, this is my fake self, this is my real self. And when it's like that, it's kind of, it's hard, because some of it is you, some of it is protection, or some of you is not feeling safe. So there's a real you and there's a unprotected part of you that's not feeling safe. So most days you can't, it's not like there's a percentage, of me being me in this situation, 10% here, 15% here, it's all this. It's just this thing, right? That's all mixed up together, and it's hard, because Sometimes you're completely yourself, but you're not always completely yourself. Both are true. Two things can be true. Not one can one doesn't cancel out the other. It might be you, but it's not always you. I think you get the picture. And it's not a contradiction, you know. It's just what decades and decades and decades of living this type of life looks like in reality, in real time. So then what I want to pose to you is that the question really that we should be asking is, how does she, Cardi B, actually do it? How is she always able to be herself? At least for the most part, right? Maybe it's not 100, but for more than it's not. It's there evident enough for everyone to be unequivocably sure about who she is. Like, she doesn't change. Everyone is saying the same thing about her. So she's herself. How is that possible? That's the question. And I have a theory. My theory is that Cardi didn't come through a lot of the conditioning and the things that we learned. You know, she didn't come through a time when you learned that you being yourself was not enough, and that you had to shift and change and curate so that things didn't get tricky, so that you didn't lose friends, so that you wouldn't be judged. She didn't come through those times where rather than deal with that, we pretended. Because in essence, survival for us was pretending to be another person or a version of ourselves. Her survival mechanism, remember this is my theory, was the actual opposite. It was quite the opposite. It came from her being herself, being loud, being extra, being exactly that. Before she made money, before she had all the notoriety and the fame that she has today, that bluntness that she's synonymous with is where she started. It's not something that she had to unlearn. She didn't have to unlearn being polite so that she could be her blunt self. She was herself so that she didn't have to unlearn anything, So that's my theory. She didn't go through the professional conditioning that many of us high-achieving women, especially black women, go through or went through. There was no corporate ladder teaching her who she has to be to get that promotion, who she has to be so that she's not labeled as aggressive or being difficult or not a team player. So different training, bring out different reflexes. So that's my theory. For her, being unfiltered, being herself, being blunt is the product. That's her, and that's her product. There's no financial or social incentive to be otherwise, so that she didn't need to file herself down, minimize herself, change different parts, learn how to not say this or say this in a different way. Where for majority of us, the curation, the acting, that version of ourselves is what allowed us to attain levels of success. Not because we weren't brilliant at what we did, but because for our brilliance to be taken seriously, for our brilliance to be allowed to be at the forefront, for us to be compensated for the brilliance, the intelligence, and all the things that we truly are, we had to have this version. We had to bring it in a way that was digestible for others. For her, it was the opposite. That's what paid our bills. I can't just be like this. I have to be someone people want to actually bring the talents and gifts to the surface. I know it's hard. I'm tired just saying this, and that's it for many of us. That's why we're there burned out, because we're so inauthentic. I've always had the theory that burnout didn't come from overworking, as is the popular belief. It's actually when you're not your authentic self, when you're living a life that is not yours, a life that is a lie, or a life that is stitched and mixed together. That's the quickest way to burn out. But I digress slightly. So I also think that Cardi already lost the thing that a lot of us are seeking to protect and preserve. Because when I used to see her on and even now in the comments on Love and Hip Hop, there was a lot of snickering. There was not a lot of respectability in that sense. And, people didn't really, she wasn't, you know what I mean. Not to, I don't want to, because I say it with all respect. It's unfortunate that she wasn't respected because she was herself. Because there are ways that people expect you to be and to show up and to say things in order to fit that conventional mode of a woman or an artist who should be respected, and that was never the case for her. So once that is not on the table for you, you have less left to lose by being yourself, to stay exactly who you are. And a lot of us are still deeply, deeply, deeply invested in showing up as professional and in keeping that image intact, and presenting it like, oh my goodness, there's so much noise like that. I hope you can hear me. So none of that means that we can't be who we are, and it doesn't mean that we have to be Cardi B, but there's something real in her that we can use. You may not automatically be able to drop your filter to be yourself because of decades and decades of having it there. And our stakes genuinely are not hers, right? So pretending that they are would be disingenuous. You don't go out there and just start talking crazy. Not that she talks crazy, but you know what I mean. But what we can take is noticing the specific areas in our lives where we don't have to be like that anymore. And that's one way to start too. That's one way to start being yourself, taking back your authenticity and being real. Look for low stakes environments and situations where you don't need to be like that, where you can actually be yourself, and just notice what happens. Notice what happens. It's because not every situation needs you to be like that. You can, if it's not work where you still have to be like that, chill out. Be loosen up a little bit. Don't feel like you have to be on 10 a lot of the time and present this perfect self of you, or this version of perfection that you think is keeping people, or keeping you a certain way with people. So start to loosen that a little bit and observe what happens. Not every situation needs you to be like that. You'll start to feel more like yourself, and it'll get easier and easier. But the problem is that the reflex doesn't know the difference between situations where you still have to be like that, if you feel you have to, and situations where you can loosen up a little bit more. So take it little situation by situation, low stakes environment, drop the guard, be yourself a little bit more, watch what happens, like I said, and you'll see that instead of the outcomes that you thought would be terrible, nothing happens. People genuinely are like, damn, I didn't know you were this funny. You start hearing things like that, and you see that there's more of a deeper connection, there's more depth in your interactions with folks. Cardi's proof is that the catastrophe a lot of us think will happen when we're ourselves is not a guarantee. It's not guaranteed to happen. Sometimes the opposite happens. Like I said, people start saying, oh, I didn't know you were such fun to be around. The invitations are more genuine, the connections are richer. You as you relax more into yourself, people relax more into themselves, because it's like gets like. People react to you, your genuine self, much more deeply, much more in a much more connected way than the respectable version of yourself. So anyway, so this is why I don't think the question is even about what the question we've been asking, right? It's not, are you being yourself? I think that question, when you ask yourself, are you being yourself, assumes that you don't know, or that you know the answer because you think you are being yourself. I think the real question, as I mentioned, is that would you know if you were yourself or if you were not yourself? And so Cardi never had to ask herself that question, bring it back to her, and that's the difference between her and majority of us. She just never lost the thread of who she was, so there was no finding it back or getting back to herself. She just stayed herself, continued to live her life as we see. I get into something similar where the way we felt we've had to be curating versions of ourselves, I show you that it's a biological thing and where it starts in your body and how you can tell the difference and start to, lean more into yourself. In my free training called What's Happening in Your Body Before the Yes. So the link is in the description. I would love for you to watch it before you walk into your next your next meeting or your next situation where they need to pretend, where you feel there's a need to pretend. Okay, so watch it. The link is in the description, and I'll see you in the next video. Ciao.